First, I want to introduce my terrific co-authors, Aaron Flaaen and Isaac Sorkin. Aaron got his PhD, just finished his PhD and started at the Federal Reserve System. Isaac also finished his PhD this summer and is doing a postdoc appointment at the Chicago Fed and will be on the job market. And certainly working with students of this talent is exactly the sort of stimulation from work that we were talking about yesterday, and it's certainly been my experience. This project is part of the SEN-HRS. I'm going to move on to my very complicated acknowledgement page. So the SEN-HRS project is a proposal I've had in mind since about 1998, when I brought the Census Research Data Center to Michigan. And the idea of having census data and University of Michigan survey data together seemed extremely promising. And we formally proposed that, I don't know, roughly five years ago, and it's been generously funded by the Working Longer program. The idea is to take information on survey respondents, HRS in particular, but also the SIEP, which is what I'm going to talk about today, and match it with administrative data from the Census Bureau. And the idea is not to get the data on the individuals, because at the HRS, we don't need any more data on the individuals. We have very rich data. It's to get information from the Census Bureau on the employers of the HRS respondents or the SIEP respondents, and importantly, their coworkers. And that's what I'll be talking about, that kind of link today. So the idea is to mix and match the survey data that will provide rich demographics, work history, everything we are accustomed to get from a large panel of data, such as the SIEP or the HRS, and very rich contextual information about the employers. There's a bunch of reasons why you might want to do this kind of thing. One is sort of survey methodological. HRS and SIEP are big, expensive surveys. There's some things that you really need to ask of individuals, like what are your expectations, what are your attitudes, what are the psychometric variables, such as we were discussing yesterday. You really need to do a survey for that. You don't need, potentially, for income, wealth, retirement plan. That is potentially much better got directly from the administrative data sources, or maybe not. So part of what we're studying today is what you should ask of what kind of data. The second reason is they're just very interesting questions that you really couldn't get from a survey respondent, like what's going on at the firm. You get some vague reports of what's going on at the firm, and I will show you some of those. But those are mainly how that affects the particular person. But from the business data, you can actually get whether the firm is, say, in economic distress. And that's the topic I want to address today. So we all want to thank the Sloan Foundation and the Working Longer program for the generous funding. But it's also, I think, this project, it's also to thank them for their patience. Because it's been a long time in the making. It's a complicated set of permissions required, but I think the program is willing to make these long investments. And indeed, the Sloan Foundation initially funded the LEHD many years ago, and I'll be making use of that as well. So we want to thank them both for the funding, but for the vision to let us do these very long-lived projects. So today's application is about what happens when an individual makes a transition from working at a job to doing something else. So there's a separation. And a separation is defined as I had a job last quarter at employer X, and now I'm doing something else. I might be working for employer Y, I might be unemployed, I might be retired. And what is the reason for this separation? We've been focusing a lot on retirement, and that's our ultimate goal of the SEN-HRS, retirement versus bridge jobs and so on. Today I'm going to focus on a broad range of outcomes, including retirement, mainly because we're using the SIEP. So the SEN-HRS project has the aim to do everything in parallel with the SIEP. That's an important cross-validation of the survey exercise and an important Census Bureau purpose, and as a practical matter, a way to get us going, testing the methodologies for linking HRS and census data before we got the permission. Oh, and the final thing I should say is, even as we speak, data are being, we have finally gotten permission to start the Sinhrs Project. So data, maybe today, are being walked from the 3rd floor to the basement of the Survey Research Center, and we are actually going to begin merging HRS, not the individuals, but to their employers. And stay tuned, there will be great opportunities to address many of the questions that came up today. So today's application is what happens when people separate, and in particular when they're in economic distress. So it's very well understood, there's a big literature, that when workers depart a firm that's in economic distress, typically a mass layoff in a way I'll define precisely, they not surprisingly do badly right after the mass layoff. They've been potentially laid off. But they're extremely persistent earnings losses, and puzzlingly so. Originally, when this literature started, the thought was, well, if I lose my job in a mass layoff, that says something bad about my firm, but maybe not about me. So you'd expect less of a scarring effect from a separation due to a mass layoff than, say, if I were fired for not being a great worker. So there's been this puzzling fact that the mass layoff earnings losses are very persistent. And we can dig into that today with the help of the survey data. So the question is, can you address some of the puzzles there by asking what's going on in from the worker's perspective? And the basic point is, even in times of economic distress, lots of other things are happening. So people might be retiring, and the question is the retirement due to the mass layoff, or might have I just retired anyway, and it just happened to plan my retirement, I turned 62 or whatever, and my firm was contracting. Similarly with quits, people have opportunities all the time. What's my propensity to take a new opportunity, and how does that relate to what's going on at the firm? And that we can learn by comparing the two indicators. So what we're going to learn from the survey is the perception of the individual, why they left. What we learn from the administrative data is what was really going on at the firm. Additionally, and I'll just mention this now because I probably will run out of time and not get to this. There's also a question in this mass layoff literature about what to do about people who earn zero earnings subsequently. I mean, obviously, earning zero earnings it might be a very persistent effect, but you want to know, is this zero earnings of people who have retired or are out of the labor force, or is it zero earnings for people who are searching? Precisely the question John Pancava was asking. You can't get at that in the administrative data, but we can in the survey data, and that's, I think, in the paper. I don't think I'll probably have time to get to that in detail. So how does the traditional displaced worker literature proceed, or what's going on? So this is what we call the hockey stick diagram. On the x-axis is what's going on at the firm. Zero is the firm is in sort of steady state. Going positive, the firm is growing. Going negative, the firm is shrinking. And what's graphed here is a theoretical, but it anticipates the empirical results, a graph of what separations look like. Not surprisingly, their separations increase as you go to the left. As the firm is shrinking, obviously, almost by construction, there'll be a lot more separations. We all know that the U.S. labor force is very dynamic. At baseline, or at zero, there's a lot of churning in the labor market, so separations just don't happen when the firm is shrinking because there's a lot of gross flows on top of the net flows. And interestingly, I won't have a lot to say about this, but there's a growing literature pointing out that actually separations increase for dynamic firms that are growing fast. And that's, I don't know, that's maybe not surprising, people being poached from Google to work at Uber. I think that's what's presumably going on there. So the mass layoff literature is saying, can we use the administrative data to label these separations as due to economic distress? And the conventional measure, going back to Davis et al. And Sullivan, is a mass layoff is falling 30% more. That's a mass layoff. We actually, early on, thought maybe we'll go after that cutoff. It actually turns out to be not a bad cutoff. So I'm going to accept that for the purposes of this paper, although that's something one can debate. The problem is, lots of things are going on, with these separations. You can separate for a bunch of different reasons. One is for a separation that's really due to economic distress, and we've graphed these notional figures here saying that probability of separating due to the fact the firm is shrinking probably goes up. Maybe quits go up, and maybe other go up, which would include retirement, and I'll show you that separately for older workers. So that's the question. The problem is you have this mix of things going on. Even when the firm is in distress, other things are happening. People are quitting to take other jobs, or they're retiring, or they're going back to school, and so on. So the data source is the survey. The survey will tell us the reason for the separation, basically the breakdown. And the administrative data is going to give us the x-axis of that picture. Let me tell you what the data are. So for this presentation, the survey data are the survey of income and program participation, which is a relatively short panel, representative sample of US households with a 4-month reference period, but a relatively short panel structure. We can follow people for up to 4 years, and you will see that. The administrative data is the so-called longitudinal employer household dynamics data set. This is essentially the administrative records of the unemployment system, not the receipt of unemployment compensation, but the earnings records. So it's essentially quarterly earnings records for all covered individuals in the U.S. So it's roughly 90% of the workers. This is big data. So that's important because we can use that to find the SIEPR respondents in the LEHD, so we know what's going on with them and their firms. So that provides two things. One is it gives us very good earnings information, and two, it tells us what's happening at the firm generally and what happens to coworkers who did not suffer separation. The design is to link these up. Then we define a separation as the SIP individual and the firm agree. So the job had to disappear in the administrative data, and there had to be an indicator of a separation in the SIP. That's a whole other survey question. Those align pretty well, so we're just going to take the points where they agree. The SIP contributes the reason. The LHD, as I said, contributes the earnings and the firm performance. So here's some results. This is a fairly complicated table, so let me try to explain. So this is the share of any separation. I was working someplace last quarter, I'm not working there this quarter. What are the reasons? The SIP can say it could be economic distress, it could be bankruptcy, layoff, and so on. That's about 20% of separations. About 32% of separations are quit to take another job, and the remaining 49 are quit for some other reason, or separate for another reason. Retirement isn't that common because this is a representative age sample, and so on. What this is the fraction of the people in the row where the firm was experiencing a mass layoff. So look at the distress column. So only a quarter of those who said they left in economic distress were at a firm that was declining more than 30%. So these indicators are positively correlated, but not that strongly. If you go the other way, it's about 50%. So if the firm is shrinking by 30%, about half the people say they were on mass layoff. Not surprisingly, quit is sort of ubiquitous, so it's not that common that it's at a firm that's shrinking. Interestingly, I'll drill down on this a little later, those who retire, it's not particularly at firms in economic distress. So one thing we're going to suggest, we don't have enough data to really drill in because there are not that many retirees in the SIP, is that this notion that there are a lot of retirements triggered by economic distress is not strongly borne out, but there is a relationship which I will show you in a second. So now here's the hockey stick empirically. So this is the actual separation hazard graphed against actual employer growth. So these are firms which are contracting 30 or 40%, and there are a lot more separations at those firms, but you do get this positive increasing hazard for separations. And then you have a lot of separations in even at steady firms. And this is just the distribution of growth rates. Okay? So now we want to break that hockey stick by the reason for separation using what people told us in the SIP. So these are people who left in distress. These are people who left for other, which includes retirement, and these who quit. And not surprisingly, big increase in reports of distress, and not a lot of distress for growing firms. But interestingly, there's a lot of other going on at firms shrinking, and I'll show you in the next slide how much of that's retirement. But there's also a lot of quits. So quits aren't that common. This is quit to take another job, but they increase, the rate doubles. You've got to be careful doubling rates, but it's a big increase in the hazard for firms which are shrinking. And that's quitting to take another job. That's not quitting to search. What about this for an older population? We had to slice differently because of the limits on, they're not that, the SIP sample isn't that big, and because of disclosure reasons, we had to slice and dice a little differently. So here, this is individuals 55 and, 55 and older. The blue line is other reasons for separation. That's not the same as other before. That includes economic distress, anything that's not, it should really be labeled not retired, not retirement. This is the hazard of retiring as a function of economic distress. So it does increase some, but for these older workers in firms that are declining, a lot more of the reasons for leaving has to do with, is not into retirement, it's into unemployment or looking for another job. So retirement increases a little with economic distress, but for older workers, there's a lot more going on other than retirement. So we run earnings loss regressions. Lots of interesting details. We have our own slight take on it. I'm not going to elaborate. Maybe Luigi will. And this is a plot of the regression coefficients that I just glossed over. It's easier to explain in terms of the plot. So this is the standard earnings loss regression, but broken down by survey reasons. So this is time in terms of quarters relative to the displacement. So this is the quarter right after I lost my job. So everyone in here did two things. In the survey, they had a transition from one job to something else. It could be another job or unemployment or retirement. And at the time of the transition, the firm was doing a mass layoff. Okay? And then it decomposes the outcome by the reason they said for the separation. And not surprisingly, although never, I think, before documented, it's very different. Those who said they were in economic distress, the red line, have this very standard, very big drop. That's 50% earnings loss in times of displacement. And this is conditional on not having zero earnings. So this throws out the people who totally left the labor force. And then it comes back very slowly. It doesn't, even after 4 years, it doesn't get back to baseline. If you left for some other reason, it's even worse. That might include retirement. That might include going back to school. Maybe not that surprising. On the other hand, if you were going to quit anyway because you had another job opportunity, maybe motivated by I got to get out of this firm because I'm getting off a sinking ship, or maybe I was just going to leave anyway to take another job, you do much better. And what the standard result is basically to average these all together. The bottom line of this paper is that's actually not so bad. The idea is those are supposed to be separations in terms of economic distress, which is kind of the red line, which is pinned down by the survey data. You might think it over and understates because some good things are going on, or maybe some worse things are going on. It turns out that when you average them together, they about average to this line. But it's very interesting to know what's going on under the hood. We have a complicated. How much time? Am I on time? Oh, okay. I'm actually okay. So I'll take a few minutes to explain the more complicated procedure. So this is hockey stick again, and and we have a method for trying to clean out of the earnings loss what would have happened in baseline. Okay. So And there are two things. They're basically, it's a little complicated because there are two things to clean out. One is, would there have been a transition anyway if the firm was just not in distress, if it was just normal? And then the other thing to clean out is what would have happened to earnings in that situation. And we can do both given the combination of the administrative and the survey data. And the basic, not the basic, the details of the method are basically to say, okay, we do this for each possible outcome. This is done for distress. So you left in distress, and actually some fraction of people whose firms aren't shrinking say they left in distress. So that's the baseline. Then, not surprisingly, that baseline is small. You can subtract off the probability of saying you would leave in distress if the firm really is in distress from the administrative data, and say this would have happened anyway. What happened anyway is basically defined as the firm had not been shrinking or growing. And that we can do that correction. And then we do the same thing for quit and for others. Then you basically calculate all the bits of the conditional probability, and here they all are. You basically say we're actually interested in what we're really interested in is the change in earnings given a true mass layoff, which we mean there really is economic distress. And we look at what we have in the data is the change in earnings given mass layoff. This is what the standard regression does in the literature, just using administrative data. And what we say is that's a weighted average of the earnings loss due to the true mass layoff times the probability of you truly separating because of the economic distress minus you would have separated anyway, given the change in earnings, given not mass layoff. Now these various pieces are identified, basically pieces of mixing and matching the hockey stick. I won't go through all the averages, all the pieces, but they add up, and that gives us the expectations loss given this true unobserved mass layoff is basically the unconditional earnings basis what would have happened anyway with the relevant probabilities, and each of these pieces is observable. So we put that together, and we basically get some of the puzzle about mass layoffs resolved. This is just a piece of it. The blue line is what would have happened to my earnings if I separated in a situation of no growth, but I reported to the SIP that there was distress. You actually do worse there. This is if you separated in the SIP, you said distress, and there was a mass layoff. The blue and the red and the black line are roughly on top of each other. That's because the sort of the raw survey thing basically adds up, as I explained before, because you have some things added and some things subtracted. By happenstance, they're sort of almost on top of each other. That's an accident. But the interesting thing is that you do get some confirmation of what people hoped to find in this literature originally, but never really found because it was a puzzle. The idea was I lose my job in a mass layoff. It doesn't really say that I'm to use a NBER term, a boof. It doesn't say that I was adversely selected because I was let go because I'm unproductive or had my finger in the till or whatever. It's just bad things happening to my firm, and it doesn't say anything about me, and I should have a quicker earnings recovery. You actually see that. So people who really were who really did separate in a mass layoff, and the survey and the administrative data agree, have faster recovery than people who separate claiming firm distress and there really was not firm distress. And you get analogous thing for quits, that it goes the other way, and that's why things are canceling out. Oops. Quits. Things are canceling out. Here is here is quitting in a mass layoff, the red line, just unconditionally. This is quitting in no growth. There you do better because you're quitting from a firm that's doing well. That's probably a better thing. That there is some scarring effect of quitting from a firm that is in economic distress. And that's what this black line is. So with quits, you're somewhat hurt by quitting in a mass layoff. Not surprisingly, not that much. If you're quitting in a firm that's doing well, that's actually quite good. Presumably you have higher wages because you're quitting because you're getting a better opportunity. And that's what's waiting on the other side and basically make things cancel out. So when you add these effects, they sort of almost lie on top of each other. The blue line is what we're calling aggregated, but is basically what you would run if you just had the administrative data and followed someone. The latent is basically what's the effect of separations conditional on being mass layoff, appropriately weighting the people who say distress, quit, and other for what would have happened otherwise. And they basically lie on top of each other because the quits are pulling it up and the other is pulling it down. So that's basically the story. I think I have a few minutes to tell you just a bit about the earnings. So again, people have done this just with administrative data, and then they don't know what happens to people who, after the mass layoff, don't have zero earnings. And typically, they're just thrown out of the data, and that makes things look better because zero certainly pulls down your earnings. But you really like to be able to separate, are those zeros people who are looking or who are out of the labor force either through retirement or a earlier life non-participation decision. You can do that with the SIEP because the SIEP has follow-up questions about what's going on. So we actually understand non-employment being unemployment versus non-participation. Here's basically what we get. The no zeros is when you throw out the people who don't participate or are unemployed. Obviously, you're going to get more mean reversion in wages. The all zeros is when you include the zeros from both non-participation and from non-employment, and it's going to be worse. And the interesting thing is it's about if you include only the zeros from the unemployed, the people who are looking for jobs, as John Pancalvo was talking about, it's about halfway between. And this is quite interesting. This result is not available in the standard literature because of lack of the information on what's going on with workers. So we do this by all these categories. So where are we? We've learned that survey and administrative measures of what's going on with a person are not perfectly correlated. This is partially a measurement thing, but mainly not. It's economics. People will quit from firms which are doing badly. They'll quit from firms that are doing well, similarly for retirement. And you need to know, and we showed there's a lot of baseline going on. This should not become a surprise to people, given the overwhelming evidence we've had over the decades that there are huge churning in the labor market, so gross flows not bigger than net flows. This is an example of a result in this. So this is not a measurement problem. It's a conceptual problem of linking up the survey and administrative data. We have a method for doing it, and you actually get a good picture into what's going on with these workers. Once we get the HRS, we will have very precise information for precisely what people want to know from this conference. Are you leaving are you going to retirement because your firm is shrinking? Is the route to retirement a bridge job, and so on. There's substantial heterogeneity, and the administrative, on the other hand, it's one of these things kind of average out. So the people who've been running these administrative data mass layoff regressions should find some comfort in this, because basically their bias is going raising it, bias is going lowering it, and we show they roughly cancel out. So the administrative mass layoff thing, for answer to the question it wants, gives you a good estimate of the unconditional response, yet to resolve this puzzle of why it doesn't really show the rapid mean reversion, because a mass layoff is not particularly informative about my characteristics of the worker, that you need the match data that we provide. So that's it. Thank you.
I don't know. Is it? So thanks to John for asking me to discuss this paper. In fact, when he asked me to discuss this paper back in, I don't know, it was June, I penciled it down for the end of November. And I got email from Matt last week. I said, wow, that's early for a paper to discuss. So then I read the email actually a couple of days ago. I realized that it was today. Anyway, so great paper. So let me give you a little bit of background, which is going to restate some of the things that Matt said. So there's a huge literature in labor about the effects of job displacement, or what is called mass layoff, on various worker outcomes. So they're looking at wages. Other people have looked at employment opportunities or other outcomes. There are actually papers on the health consequences of job displacement, or the fact that human capital investment of children is affected, or even measures of welfare, more general measure of welfare like consumption. And effects are large and persistent. This is known as the scarring effect of job displacement. In fact, just as a number, in this paper, it takes 16 quarters for wages to go back to the pre-displacement levels. And some recent paper actually noticed that the size and the duration of the scarring effects depends on when the job is lost. So it tends to be, the shock tends to be larger, the recovery tends to be slower if these jobs are lost during an economic downturn. So what this paper does, it revisits the issue by making the point that the administrative measure that we typically use to measure, to define displacement, a mass layoff, which is typically the firm must have faced a more than a 30% decline in employment, is measured with error. Some of the separations that we call mass layoff or displacement actually would have occurred anyway. So in a stylized way, you can think of all separation being the sum of three things. The natural separations, so things that are related to, for example, retirement or seasonal employment, etc. Q are the voluntary quits, and L is actually the ones that are caused by the economic distress or a firm contraction episode. And they want to isolate the effect on wage losses of the ones that really matter. That is the one that come from the LJT separations. And this was a problem that was known from the very early papers. So, if you read the Jacobson, Lalonde, Sullivan paper, which kind of started this literature, this was, something that it was very well known. So they have basically, it's taken some time to actually fix this problem that it was known from the very beginning of this literature. So you may ask, why do we care? Matt didn't spend much time, so I'm going to fill in for him. So we care because we want to have a better idea of the welfare implications of this, what we call an unanticipated shocks that may be very hard to insure against. Now, in the US, there are programs that are designed to at least partially or very incompletely insure people against events like an unanticipated displacement that come from episodes of mass layoff. Unemployment insurance, of course, is much shorter than the typical duration of this scarring effect. There are programs that work when the job displacement comes from the firm being hurt by the consequences of international trade, like trade adjustment assistance programs and so forth. Now, a broad discussion of the welfare cost of job displacement should include an evaluation of the worker's ability to self-insure, both through savings and also through increased labor force participation of spouses, etc. And not many papers in this literature actually take this broad perspective and focus exclusively on the measurement of wage losses. So this is a paper of that sort, and perhaps an interesting follow-up question for a different paper, how much the welfare implications of the welfare measurement changes once you do the adjustment. It turns out that, well, probably there's not a big difference precisely because there are these two things pulling in opposite directions. So the idea is that they're trying to use this. When the firm is contracted, we naturally expect actually all types of separations to change relative to a normal or stationary state because a shock may actually not only induce the firm to fire some workers, but may also increase the other forms of separation that we don't want to impute directly to the contraction event. So in this stylized example, Some people are fired to distress, which is the primary cause of the thing we're interested in. But then some people may actually accelerate the transition into retirement. The conflict is about working longer. This is about working shorter. And then you have the rats. Some of the rats may be leaving the ship before it sinks, which are the people voluntarily quit and find another job when they have some information on some perception the firm is doing badly, and that their head is going to be on the how do you say, the blocking chop. Exactly. So workers at stationary firm, that's the idea, give us estimates of what these N and Q flows would have looked like if there was no contraction shock faced by the firm. And the main idea is that while the mass layoff has the limitation on coming from the administrative sources as a 30% plus decline in employment, they can, and that's a great achievement of the paper or the research project here, they can match this administrative data with worker data from the SIEP, the Survey of Income and Program Participation, where you have worker specific reports about why the jobs was lost when it was lost. And among other things, people say, well, the firm was doing poorly, or I quit voluntarily, or there were other reasons. Now, do the reports agree? So I tried to summarize the complicated table that they had in this 2x2 table. So here, I'm conditioning on what we find, what we measure in the administrative data. So this is a mass layoff indicator. And these are the corresponding reports that we have in the survey. So for the mass layoff in administrative data, actually only 55% have a corresponding reports of a firm distress, or the worker says, I was basically fired because the firm was doing poorly. And the other 45% actually say that they're fired for other reasons, not because the firm was doing poorly. And here instead, conditioning on, I'm doing the opposite condition, I'm conditioning on what the workers say about the reasons why they lost the job. And I'm looking at the corresponding indicators in the mass layoff administrative data. So here the correspondence of those who say in the survey that they lost a job because the firm was doing poorly, only 28% of those are actually then reported as mass layoff in administrative data. So what are the ones and the zeros that agree, but we're not worried about? So the off-diagonal are the ones that we may be worried about. So who are these 45%? These may be guys who actually may have moved in anticipation of the firm doing badly. So these are the guys who quit voluntarily, or the rats leaving the ship before it sank. And then these 18%, the one who say that the firm was in distress, when in fact we don't record a mass layoff, maybe those who are trying to rationalize ex post the fact they were fired because they were not very productive with, the firm was doing badly. So I was fired. Well, in fact, they was fired with cause. And this discrepancy down there also have some economic meaning. So if I have an individual say, I was fired because I was doing poorly, but I don't observe a mass layoff in administrative data, it's maybe because the firm was actually not shedding as much workers to be in that threshold 30%, perhaps was doing something more limited, was closing a plant. For a big firm that is in the whole of California, they may be closing a plant in, I don't know, San Luis Obispo or something like that. So we wouldn't observe a big decline in employment, but the worker may perceive that the firm was doing badly because all the workers around him were surrounded. Or the firms may be closing an entire unit of its production process, like an R&D lab, and so we will observe a discrepancy of that sort, which is an economic event. So the firm is doing badly, but of course there is this threshold kind of indicator that may not capture what is going on. So the way I thought about the problem, and it's not the way they think about the problem, is that we really have a problem of measurement error. We have two indicators somehow of this kind of latent economic event, which is the firm is doing badly, there is an economic contraction faced by the firm. And we have these two error-ridden indicators of this latent event. So we have a classical measurement error interpretation. This is a binary thing, so it's a classical form of non-classical measurement error. So it may have it may be complicated to handle with, to handle. The paper kind of dances around this idea of measurement. It never really used it, so I'm going to propose a way of using it. I don't know if it's going to work, but at least it's my contribution as a discussant. And notice what this measurement error represent. Here we have the retirement quits that they talk about. Here we have mismeasurement that is actually in the administrative data. There's threshold issues. You say that the mass layoff only occurs when you have a decline in employment by more than 30%, but you can have forms of distress that are happening even at different levels or a lower level. Here you have information issues. So the worker may actually have some information sorry, this is the survey. So this is when the firm is in trouble, but the worker actually doesn't perceive it. So he may just be like completely clueless about what is going on. And this is what I was calling the ex post rationalization of stigma. So the worker, even though it's a true economic distress event, reported it isn't because, well, he doesn't want to rationalize the fact that it's bad. So he tries to explain it with the firm doing poorly. Speaking of economic indicators, there is an obsession in this literature with these discrete indicators of firm distress and the effect that it has on workers' outcome. But this is one thing I never understood about this literature, because the worker may actually be suffering the consequences of an economic distress on the firm side, even conditioning on him or her staying in the firm. So there's now a series of papers. I have a paper with Reconsidering about the effect of shocks to the firm performance, like measured by firm value added or sales or profits, etc., on various outcomes, including the wages and earnings. You can think of discretization just being one possible characterization of this economic relationship. There are some extreme events, job displacement, that are happening because value added falls below a certain threshold, and the firm moves from an intensive margin adjustment on the wages to an extensive margin, which is sacking the workers. And this is actually, this kind of characterization is important from how we think about the construction of the counterfactual, because it's true that the separating workers lose job and go through the consequences of that. They cannot find employment, their skills depreciate, et cetera, et cetera. But also the continuing workers at the same firm, those who didn't go on the chopping block, actually also suffer because their wages may be renegotiated, their working condition improved, they have more uncertainty, and so forth. So that control group actually is not the one that is traditionally used in the literature. In the traditional literature, the control group is continuing workers, both at mass layoff and non-mass layoff firms. And instead, that control group is going to be stationary firms, precisely because they want to identify firms having some of the separations being in the natural state or normal state, the quits or the retirement. So what is the possible implication of using that particular control group instead of the traditional one? So think about, these are the job displaced guys. So this is what happened to them. They're on a stationary path, then they lose the job, big decline, and then they recover a bit slowly. So this is the scattering effect. Now the typical control group, I would say the extreme form of the typical control group that people use in the literature, which are the workers who actually survived in the firm that went through a mass layoff episode, may also have suffered some consequences of that event. Their earnings were adjusted down. The firm say, if you want to keep working, I have to adjust your wages down. So this would be actually scattering effects, the treatment minus the control group, okay? If you think about what they're doing, they're using workers as stationary firms that somehow I can think of not going through the process of adjustment of their wages. So an extreme form of what they're doing is that they're looking at workers that have more or less a stationary path of wages, precisely because they're in stationary types of firms. So whether this amplifies the treatment control differences in wages versus the more traditional kind of control group, that's a question that I would like to see answered. In fact, there is a general question, what's the right control group in this kind of, and this is not about Matt's paper, but in general about the literature. Typically, as I said, it's continuing workers, and less frequently it's the surviving workers at mass layoff firm, which is actually my favorite because it eliminates all forms of sorting into firms on the basis of unobserved characteristics. When they look at the characteristics of their treated workers versus the control workers, they're very different ex ante. So they have to do this propensity score reweighting to eliminate the selection of the observables. But, you know, as in all cases where you adjust for selection on observable, the kind of lingering doubt is whether they have eliminated the selection of the unobservables. And one example is, you know, workers who are more risk averse electing to firms that are more stationary or offer a more stable path of wages and employment, and this may have implication for, you know, how they value the insurance that we may come up to protect them against this type of scarring effects. But of course, if you use that particular, my favorite control group, you have to handle the fact that, as Matt was saying, not people who go on the chopping block and probably don't go there randomly, or probably the worst of them do. So actually, one question that I couldn't see from the paper is why and how different this control group is relative to the, actually I couldn't even find a formal definition of whether it was like -2% to +2%. That's something that I may have missed. The stationary firms. Yeah. That's missing in the paper, or at least it's in the, somewhere in the appendix. But
it's probably deeply buried.
And you know, this is going to be important for what I'm going to say next. So at a minimum, I would present the results using traditional approach. Now, what's the alternative empirical approach? From my characterization of the problem as a measurement error problem, it seems natural to think about an instrumental variable procedure because you have two variables that are error-ridden indicators of the one that you're interested in, but presumably they have non-correlated measurement error. You know, the classical measurement error adjustment here, this is a true relationship that I would like to identify. This is the latent indicator of mass layoff or firm contraction. And the literature basically has this. As this indicator, the administrative one, that has a measurement error embedded in it because the firm may face some separation, nothing to do with economic contraction that would have happened anyway. That's their point. Or there's this threshold measurement error induced by the fact that 30% is just an arbitrary threshold, and you may have economic distress even at a lower level. OLS is, of course, biased downward. There's a standard attenuation bias. Instrumental variable, using the survey report as an instrument, is basically under some assumptions, like the errors in these two variables are correlated, gives you the delta. Now, the caveat is that this is a discrete indicator, so you have a non-classical measurement error, but instrumental variable is just upward biased, OLS is downward biased, so you get basically a bound of the true parameter. And even if there are correlated measurement errors, actually the bound can be worked out. So there are other issues, I thought that one of the problems in the literature is that we don't know what happens to individuals that disappear from the administrative data source, especially if they move into self-employment or the irregular forms of employment or in non-covered UI employment. And they have the opportunity to actually say how much, you know, because they have the non-administrative data, they have survey data, they can actually do that. And I find empirical methodology useful, involved, intricate, but also tricky. So there are some restriction on, you know, when it's going to work. For example, they need to measure this pi s, which is, unfortunately, the difference between two probabilities. So, of course, there are cases in which it may occasionally turn negative. For example, it needs to have this probability of mass layoff by survey reasons to be higher than the fraction of firms that represent their control group. So their control group can never be too large because it's going to, of course, violate this, the axiomatic restriction of probabilities. So a very nice paper doing an important decomposition exercise. And this is a decomposition exercise that's been kind of lingering in the literature for like 20 years. When was the Jacobson paper? I don't know. So this is the first paper that actually tries to get to a point that it was always there but never had been able to address, precisely because there was no way of matching the administrative with the survey. So this is great kudos for this. So I don't know if you will ever pursue this measurement error, but when I was reading the paper, that looked natural to me. And then who the stationary firms are and what they do, that would be an interesting thing to look at. Oh, wait, no one's still there.
So I'll echo previous presenters and say, please send me those great slides, because those are great comments. Some of the things we've thought about, but a number we haven't. So, but I won't. I think I shouldn't. There's a set of comments to respond to. So why don't we throw it open and then pursue the discussion later.
And I had one comment.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that there is a legal definition of mass layoff. Mm-hmm. That is, if you're a large firm, I think 100 or more employees, there's certain layoffs that are sizable enough that you have to give 60-day notification. And others that aren't. So I mean, it's not just an arbitrary 30% or whatever. There is a formula that distinguishes whether you have to give 60 days notification or not. Sure. And it is, by the way, I think for very large layoffs, I think it is about 30% coincidence, a third, I think. Yes. But also, if you lay off more than 500 people at a site, I think, whether it's a third or not, you have to give the 60-day notification. So there is a somewhat distinct, a small set of layoffs and a large set of layoffs have different rules about notification.
Yeah, I mean, there's a BLS survey that goes with that, and which has some of the, and there's been work using that, the displaced worker survey. The problem with that is it only surveys people in those situations. So, but yes, that's a point well taken.